As Shana is an expert in biodiversity valuation and nature positive finance, helping businesses and financial institutions understand the economic case for protecting and restoring biodiversity. And she's passionate about bridging the gap between nature and the economy, ensuring that biodiversity isn't just seen as an externality, but as a fundamental asset. So Shana, it's a great pleasure to have you with us. And I'm going to hand over to you for the next 20 minutes or so to just talk a little bit about what it is that that you do and about yourself. So over to you, Shana.
Thank you very much, Richard. And actually on the beavers, just to give you an idea, we did an evaluation of the beavers in Scandinavia in 2021, and on average, each beaver is worth about 1,200 euros in terms of the value they're creating for society, economy, and the environment. But I'm going to just, before I start, just a warning. My internet here has decided today to play up. So if I do freeze up, I do apologize. If I do happen to crash out, I will come back. But hopefully it lasts sufficiently long that none of that happens. Let's see. And you should see my screen with that.
Yes.
So yeah, thank you very much for inviting me to speak today. I didn't realize I'm the first person for the year. Kind of puts the pressure on me a little bit. Hopefully you find this interesting, and I welcome any questions at the end, and hopefully this helps to spur on further discussions and debates. But let me just start with a brief introduction on myself and who Endangered Wildlife is. So I'm the CEO of Endangered Wildlife. I have a joint finance and conservation background, which is quite unusual. I've been working as a sell-side institutional equity analyst for about 15 years. And since about 2005, been trying to work on how to bridge the gap between finance and conservation by actually developing biodiversity finance solutions. One of the big challenges, essentially, that I've been seeing over all these years is effectively this lack of common language when it comes to speaking about biodiversity and when it comes to the business and finance world. Because ultimately, finance talks about money, conservation always speaks about more that general wellness of the planet. And they never really they run in parallel, never really cross. So this is the gap that we've been trying to bridge effectively by converting this whole concept of biodiversity into that more common universal language, which I always laugh about and say the one universal language in this world is not a spoken language, it's money. So who is Endangered Wildlife effectively? We are a consulting and a software development company working with the financial valuation of biodiversity, both individual species and with richness, to effectively help facilitate this process of integrating biodiversity into any sort of decision. So whether that's a reporting, whether that's investments, or whether that's actually strategic decisions, it's a way to allow you to start to integrate biodiversity into those decision-making processes. And this is basically what I'm going to try address today, is looking at what services or what solutions are available to businesses to actually integrate biodiversity into activities. I decided to also just warn you, I've decided to go fairly minimalistic with the slides and give you some appealing pictures rather than boring words on the slides. So let's just start thinking about biodiversity in the context of business. So for example, we know for a fact there are about 1 million species at risk of extinction. We know for a fact that about $44 trillion are effectively at risk due to biodiversity loss. We know for a fact that biodiversity provides humanity essentially with the vital material and non-materials and regulatory services. And we know for a fact that biodiversity effectively underpins ecosystem functions, and it is necessary to ensure the resilience of our natural capital stocks. The problem is there's been insufficient attention paid to biodiversity, And effectively, biodiversity has become grossly overutilized and marginalized. Why? Because it's taken for granted. It's there. We can use it. The results coming from IPBES and other scientific studies, basically, they're all showing this major declining trend in biodiversity. And we've only seen the last, I would say, probably 18 months, policymakers reaching the point of actually acknowledging the fact that we have a global crisis. And we actually need to face this crisis as a global community to reverse the trends, because without our biodiversity, effectively, we're lost as a species ourselves. So there's this sort of need to actually start to integrate ecosystems into the decision-making process. And I usually stress this quite a lot. The solution is integration, not isolation. It's about integration, not about worrying about something on the other side of the world. You've got to integrate to actually be able to make a real difference. And businesses, economies, society, all of those in general are effectively the driving force behind the biodiversity loss. You've got the problem of overexploitation, you've got the problem of climate change, pollution, human needs, all these things. We've been very, very greedy in our own needs and not actually considered the fact that we are one of, it depends on the number or who you're talking to, but call it around 9 million species. And the goal to ultimately maximize the bottom line has effectively been very short-sighted in that it has caused these irreversible damages and actually is causing the threat to the very businesses that have antagonized our current state of being. And one of these big challenges for businesses, though, is how to actually alter that mindset and actually perceive biodiversity as an asset rather than a right to use. So one of these big challenges is to try alter the mindset, because basically a lot of companies, a lot of people, they see biodiversity as a cost, as a liability. You've got to pay for the biodiversity recovery. You've got to pay for that. But actually, biodiversity is an asset. It's actually helping businesses. I always say biodiversity is our greatest employer, our greatest employee, and our greatest trade partner. Without our biodiversity, we will not survive. Our biodiversity can actually reduce costs for businesses. It can actually improve profit margins. It can improve returns on investment. So this is where there's this sort of need to change the mindset. But part of this problem also is the fact that it's very difficult to actually interpret and understand a lot of these metrics. And when you go to try and mitigate against risks and adapt businesses, how do you do that if you don't actually understand what you're being given? So we need to try find this sort of balance between human demand and effectively natural capital supply to ensure the sustainable future for not only humanity, but also for businesses and ultimately for economies. And as I say, one of the big possible problems that I see is this lack of understanding. Had so many conversations where I say to people, do you understand this metric? And the answer is always no. You need to be a specialist to understand that sort of metric. So to be able to try transmit these metrics to all stakeholders, whether it's internal stakeholders, to the C-suite, to investors, to customers, it becomes very difficult to see that benefit if you can't even talk about it freely. And with the bottom line ultimately being the dominant thing for most companies, until the financial benefit of actually integrating biodiversity can be understood and discussed throughout that organization, especially for investors in the C-suite, there's always going to be a sort of level of reluctance of adapting mindset and actually working with and not against biodiversity. So why should businesses start to care? Well, essentially, a lot of businesses, I think, start to think that to integrate biodiversity is going to be a foregoing of profit. But in actual fact, as I said, integrating nature and biodiversity can actually reduce costs. So there was the study that was done by the WEF saying that shifting or transitioning towards this whole nature positive behavior can result in 395 million new jobs and $10.1 trillion by 2030. And even though we know this, they continue to state basically only 20% of CEOs actually recognize the risk of biodiversity loss. Now, it may be direct, it may be indirect links each business has to biodiversity, but everyone effectively does have this exposure. I've had people from marketing companies saying, how do we affect biodiversity? I said, well, do you have billboards? Yes. I said, how high? Are they emitting signals? Are they affecting bat flight paths? And they don't realize that this could actually be their interaction or their impact on biodiversity. So while companies might not see that direct or indirect relationship, or specifically the indirect relationship, one can start thinking that actually you can reduce your costs, mitigate your risks by actually supporting the biodiversity, because the biodiversity is supplying these services to you. And each of these costs and benefits ultimately should be recognized in the same way as you'd be recognizing the costs and benefits of any other asset or liability. So thinking about an example, according to IBISWorld, the largest global industry in terms of revenues is actually the life and health insurance market, which in 2023 had global revenues of about $4.6 trillion. And you might think, well, why am I talking about the health and life insurance market? It actually becomes quite obvious when you start thinking this through. If you think about what the WHO says, biodiversity supports human and societal needs. And that includes food and nutrition security. It includes energy. It includes the development of medicines and pharmaceuticals. It includes fresh water. All of these things are needed to have good health. And then you go to the CBD, and they state that biodiversity is effectively underpinning nature's contributions to people. And that is our species that are actually providing the ecosystem goods and services that are essential to human health and well-being. So we can continue talking about these sort of links between human health and biodiversity, but if you start thinking the opposite, what happens if we lose a keystone species that's effectively supporting human health? What happens then? What would this actually lead to? Would this lead to another pandemic? And how will this put strain on the insurance industry? And will this, if there's more strain on the insurance industry, will they start to increase health and life insurance premiums? So while that sort of link immediately might not be obvious, you can start saying, but what is the benefit of biodiversity to the industry? Well, it's actually a way to safeguard the insurance industry. It promotes the healthier lifestyles. It creates less strain on the insurance industry in terms of longer contributions to life insurance, and helps to possibly reduce claims against the medical insurance. And one of those species that gives a good sort of example of this relationship is something like the vulture. In India, when they lost the vulture populations, ultimately it cost the economy billions. And actually, we have done a valuation of a vulture species for an NGO that works specifically with the vultures in South Africa. And we did this valuation of the South African Cape vulture, which is a heavily poached and poisoned species. Now, why am I coming back to the vulture again? Effectively, it's calculated that the value of the population is around 26 million euros, of which just over 1% is actually a carbon sink value for the population. So if you're actually to put the right policies in place to protect these vultures, you're going to save equivalent to about 26 million euros to society, to the economy, and to the environment. But the one thing that this does not actually include in this value is, according to studies, these vultures are at risk of becoming extinct, and effectively could become extinct in about 12 years. What does this mean? Well, the key for vultures and humans is that vultures act as one of the lines of defense between carcass pathogens and healthy individuals. And this, as I mentioned, for example, in India, the loss of vultures led to a cost to the Indian public health system from 1993 to 2006 of about 30 billion euros, equivalent to around 2 billion euros per year. So now you can see the loss of biodiversity is actually going to start hitting into things. It's going to hit the economy, and going back to the insurance case, it'll hit the insurance industry. So being able to financially quantify these numbers means that the species becomes easier to understand and to recognize within that business and the business valuation process. So continuing with the next example, which feeds on from the vultures. If that vulture population in South Africa were to go extinct over 12 years, effectively, the lion is one of the species that then becomes vulnerable to these dangerous pathogens, and effectively puts that whole population at risk of extinction too. And in one of the regions in South Africa alone, the lion population is worth nearly close to 600 million euros. So losing the vultures can cause the loss of the lions, and this then has a significant impact in terms of the country and the local communities. So again, all of a sudden, you start understanding this financial value of the lion. It's no longer just Disney's Lion King and the iconic species of a lion that's got to be saved, is actually a significant financial value that has to be that is at risk to society, to the economy, to the environment. It includes things like employment, includes things like actual small businesses, includes a lot of things within this value. And this then relays that importance of actually protecting a species and investing in the long-term survival of it. This may include even R&D, such as different new technologies to help protect the species, or actually investing into the vultures to protect them, and the implicit value of the lions. But you might say, well, I'm not really interested in one species alone. We can't value every single species that we encounter. So this is where we start saying, well, what about the richness? Essentially, with the different regulatory and policies coming, regulations and policies are coming through, companies are starting to collect data. You're starting to assess risk and impact, and understand that relationship between the businesses and biodiversity. And this is what we can start to use. You're already collecting the data. You can use that to actually then start to understand the value of the richness you're impacting, whether it's a positive impact or a negative impact. It's a more all-encompassing value that effectively allows you to look at the integrity of the biodiversity within the ecosystem and determine what value is being created or destroyed through that mismanagement or management of an area. This is slightly different to where people speak about ecosystem services. So to give you a sort of example, if I was to take somewhere like London, London has a value. You know how much value is being created in London, but every single person in London has their own value. So the same way as people normally say, well, the forest or wetlands has a value, but you're not starting to account for each species that is there. If you were to remove those species, the forest will exist, but it might not be operating as efficiently and as effectively as if those species were there. So it's about taking it down and actually recognizing it's not just about that ecosystem, it's actually about what lives within the ecosystem. As an example, I was given, we're talking about, I think it was ashwood in Estonia. Ashwood is really important from a cultural perspective and tradition. But the one way of identifying the age of the tree, because it's only really valuable after it's 25 years old, one way to identify the age is through a specific lichen. If a lichen's not there, you know your ash trees aren't old enough. So you would be saying, well, the value sits in the ash trees and the carbon sequestration services that the ash tree provides. But actually, what about the lichen? You wouldn't really be thinking about the lichen. I never thought about it until I was told about it. So it's a slightly different way of looking at things. So essentially, the idea is if you can start to calculate a metric and a measure, why not start to convert it into something you understand? And effectively allow biodiversity to be directly included into this whole process of decision making. Give you another example why biodiversity is important. What if you were to invest into technologies reducing automobile collisions? Now, by understanding the value of the biodiversity, you can start to understand and warrant this investment. So you can actually start to get a measurable return. So if a company comes out with a new technology, they'll say, this is how many cars or how many lives we're going to save from the human perspective. That's only half the story. What about the value of the lives of the animals themselves? So, for example, in Europe and North America, a common roadkill is the deer, and it's one of the most likely to cause damage to a vehicle. So as I say, again, it can link to the insurance industry, can link to the automobile industry. An anti-roadkill technology would save that insurance company plenty of money. Plus, private individuals, they get to save money, which in Scandinavia alone would have an impact of nearly 1.5 million euros also on average in terms of the red deer that are saved. So what about this concept of just value? Now, the seahorse here in particular, its name is Gilbert. It probably should be Gilberta because it's a female, not a male. It's a seahorse that was protected by one of the NGOs we worked with in Cambodia that works with the rehabilitation of seagrass beds and seahorse habitats. And why it ended up being Gilbert was actually a competition we ran, but as it probably should have been Gilberta, but I'm sure it doesn't mind being Gilbert. Now, seahorses are one of the most effective predators and are very, very unique animals. But besides all the poaching and fishing, effectively they are tragic victims of habitat degradation. And without the sort of strong anchors, seahorses are swept away. And there was quite a famous photo that was taken of a seahorse that was anchored to a COVID mask that was just like floating through the ocean. Now, a seahorse, it's not a great swimmer. And without actually having a stable anchor, basically, yeah, you can imagine what will happen to the seahorse. And basically, they get swept away, and this has resulted in many areas now being functionally extinct in terms of the seahorse numbers. Now, many people will tend to start thinking about the seagrass. I know there's been a lot of focus on seagrass and the benefits of seagrass as a carbon sink, and how important it is to revive the seagrass beds for carbon sequestration and the selling of carbon credits. But is also a major shelter for species such as Gilbert. Now, Gilbert people will not pay attention to because of the fact that he's not doing much for carbon. But people are paying attention to that sea grass. But if you're actually investing into the seagrass, guess what? You're saving Gilbert's life, and Gilbert has value on his own accord. Now, there's been a lot of development and interest in terms of how biodiversity should be working with businesses. And first side is reporting. I know there's been a lot of changes in reporting, different organizations coming out with different recommendations. You know, the ESRS just came out late last year with their recommendations. Now, all of these things are important to start to identify levels of impact and exposure for businesses. But again, as I say, there's a limitation in interpretation and understanding. The other thing that's come through heavily of late is this concept of biodiversity credits and offsets. Now, I'm not sure about level of knowledge of offsets and credits within the group, but very, very broadly is the offsets are more the involuntary state-regulated mechanisms to compensate for biodiversity loss, with prices set at government regulated prices. whereas the credits is more of a voluntary thing. Different pricing mechanisms, different structures, different sizes of units, but generally it's based on, for example, a cost of conservation, not really looking at what is the value of the biodiversity that you're helping to save through purchasing of biodiversity credits. So, but whether you're talking about credits or whether you're talking about the offsets, they are serving a purpose to signify or to allow companies or businesses to signify their support for biodiversity. But there are two things that I'd like to raise against this. Is effectively, unlike carbon, biodiversity differs from location to location. A grey wolf in Scandinavia in 2021 had a value of nearly 2 million euros. A grey wolf in the same in 2022 in Yellowstone was worth about 4.8 million euros. Even on a regional basis, you're talking about differences. The same as you're talking about people, person in London is going to earn a very different salary to a person working in Cardiff versus a person working in Manchester, for example. Biodiversity has different values depending on where it is. So from the perspective of these sort of compensations, you cannot directly offset a negative action in one region with that in another region, because these regions are not homogeneous and therefore are not truly fungible. The other issue is how are they priced? Now, I think it was around 2012, Malaysia released the Biodiversity Conservation Certificate. For every 100 square meters, you paid $10. Now the question is that just? Especially when you consider that that's less than the value of a goat. So by virtue, one should start looking at just values. And by legal definition, a just value is a fair market value. The value of a cow living on 100 square meters would be worth more than $10. The value of a goat is worth more. So if you go back to Gilbert here, and the seagrass, for every hectare, there's going to be a significant amount of value being generated. So why sell that at a negligible value of less than or equal to a carbon credit? Remembering that the carbon is only one small element and is not a living organism. Therefore, with biodiversity credits, while they have huge potential to actually allow businesses to engage with conservation and consider biodiversity within activities, it's also important that businesses start to recognize these real just values. Then the values that a species or an individual is actually contributing to society, economy, and the environment. The same way as I'm not going to say we price, we value an individual when they get a job, when they get insurance, when they get credit. Why not do the same with other species? And effectively, by financially valuing it, you actually get to understand what is your real impact? What are you actually doing? Can you generate returns through the biodiversity? How do you actually live in symbiosis with biodiversity and get biodiversity to work for you? It doesn't ask for a salary, just ask for a place to live and a healthy environment in which to live. So by actually ensuring that habitat restorations, you're protecting ecosystem integrity. By planting trees for carbon, that's not always going to be the solution. Sometimes it can actually be detrimental if those trees are not meant to be living in that area and you actually destroy a thriving, healthy ecosystem. And this is why it's so important to then start thinking, how do you actually maximize that impact and value of the biodiversity, which often exceeds that of just carbon sequestration. Just to demonstrate the effect of this, in 2022, we did a revaluation of the Yellowstone wolves. And on a year-on-year basis, it went up from 3.4 million to 4.8 million. Now, this represents effectively a 38% year-on-year increase. Now, for the same period back in 2022, you could see the carbon price increased by 20% year-on-year. The government bond from America was a 3% yield, and the equity index declined over 16%. So effectively, that grey wolf, when priced at its just price, outperformed the rest of the market in terms of as an asset. which means once the true value can be understood, there's more incentive to actually support the foundations of life on this planet and make a greater impact that is more meaningful than just what regulations ask for about ticking boxes for reporting purposes. So this is actually, to me, by understanding value, by attributing value to everything that's living around us, you actually get to quantify those SDGs that you're making commitments to, such as the life on land and life underwater. And this is actually what people should be working for. It's not the solution to rely on the concept of 30 by 30. That's a very temporary measure, and tell a shark that if it's in the Bahamas waters, it's safe, and the moment it enters Florida waters, it's not safe. Species migrate, even humans migrate, and they don't know this is a protected area, this is not a protected area. Rather, instead of thinking about, well, how do I worry about what's on the other side of the world? Let me make my own local corridor. If every business creates its own local corridor, you don't really need the 30 by 30 because you're creating more than the dictated amount. And for people who then say, well, it's going to cost me money to do that. I had an example with industrial warehousing. Well, if you're to green the warehouses, yes, it's going to cost you an initial capital expenditure, but you're reducing your carbon emissions, you're improving the water, you're reducing your electricity bill, plus you're creating value through your biodiversity. Guess what? You can actually calculate an ROI against that investment and potentially justify why it's worth more to actually invest into greening those roofs. So to me, this is that mindset that needs to be shifted to allow the private sector to actually start to realize they can make a real difference. It doesn't take that much to actually make that difference that's there and to actually then benefit. So if you were to take this wolf as an example, now that wolf is owned by the American government. But say, for example, we're not talking about wolves, but red squirrels in the UK. On average, a red squirrel in Scotland is worth about 1,800 pounds. Now, if you were to help help one squirrel to survive, and you have the squirrel nesting in your trees on your property, now perhaps you have an intangible like custodial right. Now, can we start saying that that intangible custodial right is an intangible asset in your balance sheet? You understand the value of that squirrel. The squirrel goes up from 1,800 pounds to 2,000 pounds. That's a gain on revaluation of intangible assets. Guess what? That can feed through to your P&L. Now, all of a sudden, by integrating biodiversity into your business, you could be driving up your P&L and your profitability at the same time.